I feel like summer is supposed to be a time of taking it easy and not having as much to do, but it doesn't feel like that's how 2023 is panning out. Oh, so much travel, so much good stuff happening. Hope your summer is going really well. We're back. Today's going to be an interesting show because, as you know, we're generally focusing more on the med device side of the world. Today, we're going to be talking about drugs and biologics almost exclusively, in addition to the events that are coming up in the local and national ecosystem. So hope you enjoy it. It's going to be a little bit of a different twist, including some things from FDA about communications. How should drug companies, in this case, communicate to patients and users of the drugs the safety and efficacy and risk data associated with that? It's really interesting. It's like, hey, user, we want you to know about this thing that you're taking. And FDA's got some recommendations on that. It's going to be fun, in addition to some things on oncology and diabetes, and also who would have predicted, but the EU MDR now threatening to create shortages in devices for children. All that and more coming up on MedTech Crossroads. You can always get a hold of us at contact@medtechcrossroads.com. Don't hesitate to reach out. There's a topic you'd like us to cover, a question you have about something we've covered on the show, or an event you want us to announce. We try to make sure that this is yet another place where people can find out about local and national events coming up of interest to the medtech development ecosystem, whether you're a funder, whether you're an innovator, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a manufacturer, a vendor, service provider, or just somebody interested in how medical technologies make it to market. That's what we're here to talk about. As far as events go, we cull events that we think are going to be of interest to you from a number of sources, including MEDC, MishBio, Project MedTech, the US FDA, Ann Arbor Spark, the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, and more. And some of those events that are upcoming, you can find all of these in the YouTube description now. We've finally consolidated all these. It's the easiest way to communicate them. All the links are in the YouTube description. So just head on over to YouTube /IntoBeing LLC, and you can find all these links. The first one, today is the deadline. MedTech Ignite by MassMedic. If you're a startup thinking about getting part of an accelerator, you want mentorship, you want training, you want networking. I mean, we love Michigan, but I got to say Boston is a hotbed of MedTech. And so if you want to get connected with MedTech Ignite, you can do that through MassMedic. The link is in the YouTube description. FDA has a webinar coming up. This one particularly stood out to us. Final guidance on the content of pre-market submissions for device software functions. So you've got software in your device, or you've got software as a device, and you're thinking of submitting a 510K or a de novo. What needs to go in that 510K? That is something they're going to be talking about in this webinar, July 20th, 2023. It's free. I don't even think you have to register. The link is, again, in the YouTube description. And then the Midwest Showcase coming up. Dwayne Mancini from Project MedTech running this August 30th, 2023 in Cleveland, Ohio. A number of familiar faces going to be down there in Cleveland on August 30th. Investors, hubs, accelerators, etc. And then on September 18th, the Michigan Life Sciences Showcase. They're combining medical devices, biotech, their life sciences. I think cannabis is even included, like it's everything together that could have to do with health. Coming September 18th to Lansing. And the MedTech Conference coming to Anaheim, October 9th through 11th of 2023 at the Anaheim Convention Center, where we were just earlier this year. That's it for the events. Next up, we're going to talk about a few items of FDA and industry news of interest to our ecosystem. Got my notes here. MedTech Crossroads, June 30th, 2023. This first one. So this is interesting. We're usually device heavy, and this week most of the news was drug and biologics related. So really, really interesting. We do have one device thing at the end, but this I thought would be of interest to a lot of people. Type 1 diabetes. FDA approves the first cellular therapy to treat patients with type 1 diabetes. And you're going to get, this is, Gene learning all about diabetes live on air. So the company is called Celtrans. That doesn't appear anywhere else here, so we wrote that in there. The company is Celtrans that got this approval from FDA. The drug is called Lantidra. It is the first allogenic pancreatic islet cellular therapy made from deceased donor pancreatic cells. We'll unpack that in a minute, but that's what this thing is. It's a allogenic pancreatic islet cellular therapy made from deceased donor pancreatic cells for the treatment of type 1 diabetes. This is if you can't hit your targeted glycated hemoglobin or your average blood glucose levels, even though you're sort of doing everything else right with your insulin. So I wanted to take a step back because the drug side of the world isn't something we talk a ton about. And in fact, I guess I'm thankful it's not something that I have experience with diabetes. Type 1 diabetes affects 1.24 million people in the US. And it's basically something that happens when your pancreas that's supposed to make insulin, and insulin is supposed to regulate your blood sugar, isn't happening. Something's wrong. It's usually something wrong with your pancreas. And with unregulated blood sugar, it tends to just skyrocket and you become hyperglycemic. So patients take insulin. It keeps their blood sugar down. But keeping your blood sugar down is this thing called hypoglycemic, right? And any of us who've ever struggled with that just from not eating enough food sometimes know what that can do to you. So it's this battle, and there are patients, actually, apparently, this is not medical advice, I've just been learning this myself. There are patients who can become tolerant to their own hypoglycemia, meaning they are unaware that they've got too little blood sugar. So now either you've got too much blood sugar and your body can't process the food that's coming in, or you're taking insulin, but it's suppressing it so much that you've got low blood sugar and you need to let it back up a little bit. So here's an example of a person who is not able to adequately regulate their type 1 diabetes through taking insulin. The dosing just isn't working out. So this is interesting. The primary mechanism of action of this Lantidra is believed to be the secretion of insulin by the infused allogenic islet beta cells. Infused allogenic, we're going to unpack that one here in a second. Apparently, in some patients, these infused cells can produce enough, they produce insulin. The cells are actually producing insulin. So it's administered by a single infusion into the hepatic portal vein. So what is this? Allogenic, denoting relating to or involving tissues or cells that are genetically dissimilar and hence immunologically incompatible, although from individuals of the same species. Okay, so allogenic means these are coming from somebody else. Islet, these are allogenic islet beta cells. The islet of Langerhans, I hope I pronounced that right, I probably didn't, are groups of pancreatic cells secreting insulin and glucagon. Oh, so these cells actually secrete insulin. Neat. Beta cells are the particular type of cell found in pancreatic islets that synthesize and secrete insulin and amylin. Wow, interesting. So if you've got type 1 diabetes, beta cell mass and function are diminished, leading to insufficient insulin secretion and hyperglycemia. Well, that's interesting. So by infusing these allogenic islet beta cells, these cells that are producing insulin and can keep producing insulin, you're basically putting a time delay release product right into the liver portal vein of the patient. So it actually, the idea is that it smooths out that dose, which is pretty cool. They did 2 non-randomized single-arm studies, 30 participants with type 1 diabetes, and it sounds like 21 patients out of 30. And we're going to be talking in a minute about numerators and denominators in reporting data. But I think what we're saying here from FDA, 21 participants out of 30, that seems to be what they're saying, did not need to take insulin for a year or more, with 11 participants not needing insulin for 1 to 5 years. Wow. And 10 participants not needing insulin for more than 5 years. But 5 participants did not achieve any days of insulin independence. So broken up there, it'd be interesting to see a graph of that, but 5, so what is that? About 15%, a little bit more than 15%, didn't get any benefit from it, but quite a few did, at least a year, if not more. So this is just really interesting on the biologics side. We don't see a lot of biologics, but this one, for such a common condition, 1.24 million people, and such a neat idea. Put the kind of cells in that are going to secrete insulin and hopefully smooth things out. Not medical advice, but certainly something of interest to those who can't achieve control of their type 1 diabetes through insulin alone. So kudos to FDA for getting that cleared. Next up, conveying medical device information through labeling and advertising. Now, this is a typo on our MedTech Crossroads title slide. This is actually drug specific. I think the advice is really good for devices as well, but this is drug specific. This is direct to consumer promotional labeling and advertisements guidance for industry. DTC, direct to consumer. Now, of course, FDA starts out with ideas about non-misleading information. Information has to be truthful, non-misleading, convey information about the drug's efficacy and its risks in a balanced manner, and reveal material facts about the drug. Well, yes, it wouldn't be FDA if we weren't saying the obvious. But this guidance really goes beyond that, and I think it is actually fascinating. They get into quite a few studies that they cite, talking about how quantitative, that is not qualitative, right? Qualitative is just the quality, like, oh, it got better. Quantitative is, oh, it got better by like 5% according to these criteria. So not quantitative, but, not qualitative, but quantitative information can improve consumers' accuracy in estimating the drug's benefits and risks. Because consumers differ in their interpretations of qualitative descriptions. We'll get into some examples. Kudos to FDA for actually showing some examples a little bit later. Consumers can use quantitative efficacy and risk information to form more accurate perceptions about the drug. FDA says that these groups should show control information as well as the data. And that goes without saying. It was actually just recently talking with parties that will not be disclosed. We discovered that one of them was trying to report data while the control changed. Well, that's disappointing. You can't take that to the bank. The whole point of a control is that it needs to stay the same or do something predictable in a way that allows you to make a comparative measurement. So FDA is kind of stating the obvious, but unfortunately we see this kind of thing all the time, that the treatment group is isolated from the control group and claims are made without showing what the control actually did. And FDA is saying, no, you really need to show your control. Research suggests that consumers can use the information about the control group to form accurate perceptions about a drug's benefits and risks. And they cite 3 studies there: O'Donoghue, Schwartz, and Sullivan. Now, part of me is, maybe I'm just too skeptical, but part of me sort of wonders, like, wow, really, people can understand the idea of control groups if they're not scientists or engineers? But I think there is sort of that basic idea of, I didn't do anything, and this is what happened to the people. And then I did something, and this is what happened, and I see a difference or I don't see a difference. Now I can make a decision about that. It is actually a pretty simple concept. This next one is fascinating: absolute frequencies or percentages. And I'm sure we've all seen this, but FDA is recommending that firms present quantitative efficacy or risk probabilities in terms of absolute frequencies. So, say 57 out of 100 patients improved, or 57% improved. That is relatively easy to process. I know what to do with that. If I have to perform a calculation to have a clue what to do with the data, FDA is saying that's not as easy to process. So here's an example. If a firm was developing a magazine advertisement showing that most patients experienced a response after 12 weeks of treatment with drug X, FDA would be recommending that they present that in terms of an absolute frequency, saying something like, in a clinical trial, 78 out of 100 patients experienced a response after 12 weeks of treatment with drug X, compared to 20 out of 100 patients on placebo. That is a good, useful, understandable kind of a result. Now, you may want to ask, how much better did they get? Can we quantify that aspect? And that would also be an important question. What FDA is not as excited about is relative frequencies. Research suggests that consumers do not understand relative frequencies. Maybe because they're ambiguous. Maybe that's why. Because it can be very ambiguous to say something like there was a 33% reduction in symptoms. It sounds great if you can put a high enough number on it, but it's not actually clear what that means. Or somebody is 3 times as likely to experience a side effect. It's almost like ignoring the control group. It sounds great, but 3 times of a very low number still isn't very meaningful. So they're saying use absolute frequencies rather than relative frequencies. And if you're going to present it as a relative frequency, give some context to the numbers. So I think this is fascinating, having been someone raised on numbers and how those numbers are presented. We do see this kind of problem a lot in the presentation of information, especially in marketing literature. FDA also noted that many companies are coming with more and more quantitative data. So they're not just saying, hey, it got better, give us clearance. They're coming and saying it got this much better, and we want to include that in our marketing literature. Now, this one is fascinating. You can make things seem better by putting information in different kinds of terms. You could diminish risks and increase efficacy just by a perception of how you present the information. So FDA notes that when you characterize efficacy or risk information quantitatively in a promotional piece, don't alternate between qualitative and quantitative descriptors. 80 out of 100 patients got better, and not many of them died. Okay, good, but maybe we should quantify both of those or keep them both qualitative. Also, use frequencies with the same denominator. I thought this was really, really interesting. Again, as somebody who was raised on data, the same denominator, because if I tell you that, let's say that 10 out of 20 patients got better, and only 1/5 of them had adverse events. 10 out of 20 got better, and only 1/5 of them had adverse events. Wait, let's think about that. 1/5. Well, that's 4. That's 4 out of 20 had adverse events, but only 10 of them got better. Huh. When you put it in those terms, the numbers are much more comparable, but 10 versus 1, and I ignore the denominator, makes it seem not as big a deal. So they're saying use the same denominator when reporting these kinds of information. At some level, who cares about this, right? Hey, I'm not making the marketing literature. Well, actually, a lot of you are. A lot of you we know are making marketing literature, whether it's for drugs or devices. But maybe the most important thing to realize here is that FDA is getting kind of nuanced in how they're thinking about these things. They're not just saying, is your marketing literature factual? Are your promotional materials factual? They're actually issuing guidance to say, we believe that, to use a term from a different part of the industry, the usability of your promotional materials needs to be there. There actually is a responsibility to communicate something that's understandable to the patient, not something that further clouds the issue. Now, different parts of the government could probably take their own advice. I read a government document recently that was saying that 4 out of 5 government elements believed that something happened with a low probability. And 1 out of the 5 believed that a different thing happened with a moderate probability. Talk about obfuscating data in a very, very qualitative sense. So again, anyone presenting data could benefit from this. FDA's focus very much on the drug company's promotional literature. But they don't stop there, including titles, headers, captions for visual aids. We see this in data reporting all the time, even with researchers that come to Into Being, where they don't actually show or appropriately scale what their graphs mean. And bringing both the numerator and the denominator into the graphic is really important. Here, I made an example. If you make a graphic that says, hey, we helped 10 out of 1,000 people, that's a pretty cool graphic. Steve, would you buy my drug right here? I'm offering you a drug. We helped 10 out of 1,000 people.
Boy, I don't know. 10 out of 1,000.
You like my graphic, though? It's lots of people there.
That is lots of people.
It feels
that is 10.
Lots of people, yeah. There's 10.
Where's the other 990?
Oh, you mean this graphic. You mean this
excellent.
graphic. We helped 10 out of 1,000 people. You got 1,000 people there, and over here, there's my 10. I only want $10,000 per dose, Steve. You signing up?
Well, it depends on how life-changing it was for those 10 people.
Whoa, you got me there. You brought in the right other variable. That's exactly right. It does depend on things. There are cases where you would, if it was good enough, you might even take that chance. But this is the point that FDA is making. Man, Steve's a smart buyer. We should all be as smart a buyer as Steve. Like, what am I getting for my money and the probability associated with it? But here's the thing. A graphic on the left doesn't give you the context, even though it's truthful. Like, what does truthfulness take? Truthfulness takes adding this denominator. But there isn't the denominator in the graphic down here. It's only when you have the denominator in the graphic, which is this thing compared to the actual people that you're helping, have you really communicated truthfully what is going on in your promotional literature. Here's another example of a good graphic showing the axes labeled, the percentages, and what they are. They're percentages, not counts. As well as captions for what each color means, as well as a title of the graphic. Can't tell you the number of times we've had data presented to us here at Into Being by innovators who don't do basic labels on their graphs. Now, of course, FDA here is talking about reporting to consumers in promotional literature for drug efficacy and risk. But this lesson goes way beyond that. It really is miscommunicating to not adequately label a graphic of data like this. And FDA is calling it out, which means that you're probably going to get asked questions on it if you find yourself presenting data in promotional literature in ways that the agency says is misleading. Well, in keeping up with the non-device thing, we're talking about oncology, cancer therapies. Now, it was even a few years ago when we started talking about real-world data. FDA has a push, and industry has a push for incorporating real-world data. It makes sense that not everything can be tested before a product is released into the wild. You're going to learn things about it. And in fact, things have been learned about similar devices or drugs. So wouldn't it be nice to use those in your clearance? Wouldn't it be nice to be able to look at something in the wild and be able to use that information in the aggregate to be able to predict things and say things about your clearance for your drug or for your device? And that's behind this QCARD, Oncology Quality Characterization and Assessment of Real-World Data Initiative from FDA. FDA says, our initial experience with oncology real-world data submissions suggests that early proposals for studies incorporating real-world data often lack basic elements of study design and characterization of the data source to facilitate an appropriate evaluation from our review teams. Here are some very basic things that they're saying should be there, like, this is pretty basic. Who is the sponsor? Who provided the data? Who analyzed it? Regulatory history, the status of the study is, and that continues. What's the care setting? Was it home or hospital? Rationale for why you selected it. When did the data come from? What period? Design. What was the disease or condition? It almost beggars belief that this wouldn't be something that would always be included. But again, I got to come back to how data is often presented to us and say, no, it actually makes sense. People will present data because they know what went into it. In an email somewhere, they think they know what this data means or where it came from. And FDA is simply pointing out, as we often have to do, you need the pedigree of that data that you're sharing. Where did it come from? Who collected it? How did you collect it? When did you collect it? What are the mitigating factors surrounding it? So all these kinds of things, different parameters, they would like to have this kind of stuff there. But they call this early proposals of oncology studies using real-world data. The point here is that FDA doesn't believe that what should be in this is fully defined yet. So they've reached out to the Reagan-Udall Foundation. Now, I found this interesting for more than just the oncology question. The Reagan-Udall Foundation for the Food and Drug Administration, get this, have you seen this before? I have not, is an independent 501c3 organization created by Congress. Huh. To advance the mission of FDA, but it's not FDA, to modernize things. Huh. Interesting. It serves as a crucial conduit between FDA and the public, providing a means for FDA to interact directly with stakeholders, but the foundation does not participate in regulatory decision-making or offer advice to FDA on policy matters, which doesn't quite, I guess in my mind, doesn't quite line up with the objectives that FDA and the Reagan-Udall Foundation have, which are nevertheless, I think, good objectives. I just want to call attention to this. I've never seen, maybe I'm naive, I've never seen a 501c3 stood up by Congress to do something for an agency that the agency maybe isn't doing itself. Open question. I'm just going to let that one sit. But the objectives of the foundation and of the FDA to review the current published literature, guidelines, and guidances on real-world data quality and dimensions of quality measurement to inform knowledge, identify gaps, and build on previous conceptual models. And that is important, right? If we don't understand what kind of data should be included or how it should be included, we're not going to be able to utilize data that's actually out in the wild or being collected from the wild. Define key study and data elements necessary to guide fit-for-purpose real-world data assessment in the context of oncology-specific research. And engage stakeholders to obtain feedback on essential study design elements. So you might be going out to hospitals and caregivers and patients and saying, hey, you know, this is what we're going to ask for. Is this okay? Which is a great way to go about that. So this is a fascinating thing. It's neat to see FDA asking what kind of data should be present so that they aren't stymied when it comes time for a submission. We've all been part of submissions where you get to FDA and FDA is only just then discovering what kinds of questions it needs to ask. So it's good to see them proactive on this question. It does sort of raise a question, though, as to what's going on with a congressionally stood up 501c3 and how that happened or why that happened. I'd love to know more about that. Maybe we'll get somebody on to talk about that. But that is the news on oncology and real-world data. Well, I know the author of this article said that it came as a surprise, but we've been talking about this for a year, nearly a year. The EU MDR. Reintroduce. Here's the word, reintroduce. In Europe, you're having to reintroduce devices. They can't just stay on the market. If you want to keep them on the market, you've got to go back through MDR. They pushed MDR out to 2027, 2028. But in this article from Elise Reuter from MedTech Dive, we knew that devices were going to get pulled from the market, not be available in Europe. And now they're starting to look at what's the effect on kids going to be. It's a good question. Because it turns out that next year, 2024, is when these devices need to get submitted to notified bodies in order to make it back through the process in time for a 2027 or 2028 deadline. This quote from the article, reports available to clinicians indicate a high likelihood of losing significant numbers of essential medical devices. This will result in an avoidable risk of death and serious injury, not as a consequence of unsafe medical devices. No one's saying these are unsafe. They've been on the market. But as a consequence of disappearance of devices due to unforeseen effects of the EU MDR. Now, I might disagree with the idea that these effects were unforeseen. We've been saying that they're going to come for the last year. There was also a characterization made in the article, which it's not quite correct. It's a one-off anecdote talking about a company that had to pay $800,000 to get their CE mark through a notified body. And they made a comparison and they said, oh, that's versus about 5,000 euros to get a 510K. But it doesn't cost 5,000 euros to get a 510K. They're sort of comparing apples to oranges here. But the point is that European companies are having to incur extra costs. When we were at Medica last year in Dusseldorf, Germany, companies approached us and said, we can't stay on the market here. We want to come to the U.S. Their perception is that coming to the U.S. is easier, better, faster, cheaper than staying in Europe. The upshot, the concern, well, what about the kids? Especially pediatric medical devices, which are hard enough to keep on the market as it is, because we've got more adults using medical devices than kids. It was hard enough to keep them there in the first place. What about when you take the companies and make them go through MDR? So the rolling train wreck of MDR continues. We'll keep on top of it. And obviously, if you're wrestling with those kind of questions, always a fascinating topic that really comes down to brass tacks for a lot of companies worldwide. Well, that's our news for today. We're going to give just a moment. We sure appreciate you being with us today. We're going to give just a moment to see if there are any questions or comments out there. I'll give it just a moment to see if any pop up, whether in Zoom or in the YouTube channel. What kind of plans you got for the July 4th weekend? Fireworks? Bugs. Steve, I'm planning on bugs. We have some delicious horse flies by the end of our driveway. Not delicious like you eat them, but they eat you. That's kind of how it works.
Oh, so they think you're delicious.
They think, but I don't want to brag, but I think that's kind of where we are. So we stay away from the end of our driveway. Hope everyone has a wonderful July 4th holiday. Enjoy the time. Hope you get some time off, and we'll see you next week on MedTech Crossroads.